Hello, everyone. Today is my STEM for Tomorrow lecture on biology and ecology. So, this lecture will be probably about 40 minutes, and then I will have about 10 minutes at the end left for questions. So, please, when we get to that time, type questions in the chat. If you have any questions, please wait till the end. This will be mainly focused on biology and ecology, but if you have any questions to the science fair about at the end, I am willing to answer those if you have anything with that. So if you will hold for 5 seconds. Oh, did that. Oops. Okay, an introduction to ecology and biology. So a quick English lesson. Bio means life and logy means the study of. So biology is the study of life and ecology is a subset of biology which works with classifications and the different relationships between different species. So how do we classify different species in life? Scientists like to classify and figure out classifications of everything. And they do this through grouping things. And finding out ways to group things makes it easier to communicate between scientists. So one big way of classifications is this life, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species system. So this is the basis for all of biology. Basically, a bunch of scientists got together and they were finding a lot of problems because they couldn't find anything common to talk about. They would make a discovery in this one species, but then they would talk about it, and then no other scientists from other countries would know what they're talking about because they had different names for all of these different species. So there needed to be a common language. On top of that, it was very interesting for scientists to figure out that certain species resembled other species similarly. And why are a shark and a tiger so different and what makes them different? So they set out a way to find groupings of things. So in this life to species system that we have, species are all of the same animal, but the closer to a species you are, the more similar you are. So if you're in the same genus as another species, then you have a lot of similar characteristics. Unlike if you were in the same domain, because a shark and a tiger are in the same domain, but those aren't even remotely similar. So it becomes more general the further you go out. So a fun way to remember this is King Philip came over for garden salad. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So I'm going to do a quick deeper look into each of the different kingdoms because kingdoms are generally have very easy to follow characteristics and they're pretty important to know instead of the differences between certain orders because that's just less important and no one's going to ever ask you the difference between two orders. Just picking one in that grouping. So some vocabulary before we start. This is a lot of the terms I'm going to be using and just to know the difference between them. So prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are they were the original forms of life and they're these small cells. You can see it's the left photo and they look like pills. And they don't have a lot of the organelles that are very important in life, like a mitochondriac, and they don't have lysosomes and ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, which eukaryotes do. And a lot of their DNA is just floating in the cytoplasm, which is this gel that fills up the cell. They also have a tail and hair, and they were the original life forms. But the big difference most people make is that they don't have a nucleus. And a nucleus is the brain of the cell. It's what sends out orders to all the other organelles. So eukaryotes came along later, and they're more complex versions of cells. And they do have organelles. They have a Golgi complex and a lysosome and all the things you can see. And they do have a nucleus, which sends out all of these orders, the brain of the cell. So the big difference is the no nucleus and the nucleus, but there are more differences. And all you need to know is that eukaryotes are way bigger and way more complex. Another big difference is autotrophs and heterotrophs. So auto is like own. So autotrophs is you're able to make their own food. So plants are able to make their own food with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is this chemical reaction that goes on with plants where they take energy from a combination of carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to produce food for themselves, and as a byproduct they have oxygen as well. So that's creating their own food. They're able to do it themselves. So heterotrophs, to contrast that, heterotrophs need to gain energy from outside sources. So a lot of people immediately think like a bear eating a fish, like eating an animal, but deer eating grass would also qualify because deers have to go outside of themselves to get food. So even if it's just vegetation that they eat, it still counts as a heterotrophs. So autotrophs are really only going to be producers and really only going to be plants. Even decomposers are a different thing outside of these two groups. Another difference is unicellular versus multicellular. So the prokaryotic and the eukaryotic things that I was mentioning earlier, that is all one cell. So if your entire animal organism is only made up of one cell, then it's considered unicellular. Most things you're going to see are multicellular, meaning they are made up of multiple cells. So we are made up of multiple cells. So it's most of the kingdoms will be multicellular. So doing a deeper look into the kingdoms, or first we'll start with domains. There are 6 kingdoms, and they fall under 3 domains. There's archaebacteria, eubacteria, plantae, animalia, fungi, and protista. And they fall under 3 domains. So after life, which encompasses everything, the next classification is domains. So I just wanted to mention this and put this here so you get a framework for which kingdoms fit under which domains. Archaebacteria fits under archaea, eubacteria fits under bacteria, plantae, animalia, fungi, and protista all fit under eukarya. So archaea are all prokaryotes, which means they don't have a nucleus. They're the very basic cells. They're unicellular, meaning they're one cell, and they could be autotrophs or heterotrophs. Bacteria is prokaryotes as well. No nucleus, simple cells. They're unicellular, meaning they're just one cell, and they could be autotrophs or heterotrophs. These are actually very, very common. And then eukarya, they are eukaryotes. They're multicellular or unicellular, and they could be autotrophs or heterotrophs. So they could pretty much be anything. The kingdoms, like I mentioned, we have plantae, which is plants, animalia, which is animals, fungi, protists, eubacteria, and archaebacteria. So now that we know the 6, let's delve a little bit deeper into each of the 6. We have plantae. Plantae are multicellular organisms. I already mentioned this. They're made up of multiple cells. So they are walled eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic, they have a nucleus and they have organelles. They're the more complex cells. But they also have something called a cell wall. So something you'll learn once you get into biology is the difference between animal cells and plant cells. And the fact is that animal cells have something called, all cells have something called a cell membrane, which is the outside of the cell. But plants and fungi have something also called a cell wall. So if you look to the right picture, it's the rigid green structure. And this makes everything a lot more rigid. It contains it more. So they also have a cell membrane, but the cell wall is a very, very important difference in biology. And their principal way of getting energy is through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, again, is when a chemical reaction plants do through sunlight and carbon dioxide. to produce glucose, which is their food. They also usually contain chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is this green dye that you see in a lot of plants. And it's the reason that most plants are green, because they have this chlorophyll that floats around and dyes the plant green. Not all plants have this, but if a species did have chlorophyll, they would be a plant. So, yeah. Then we have animalia. We are part of this kingdom, as well as all these adorable animals you see. It is multicellular, meaning it is made up of multiple cells. It is also heterotrophic, which means they have to go outside of themselves to make food. We also have eukaryotes, meaning they have a nucleus and have complex organelles. Like I mentioned earlier, they do not have a cell wall, they just have a cell membrane. It's the difference, it's a really big difference between their cells and plantae and fungi cells. They typically reproduce sexually, and again, mankind is in this kingdom. This encompasses a huge amount of life we see today. Think of pretty much anything and it fits under here: shark, an elephant, a dog, anything. So this one is usually easy for a lot of people to understand. Then we have fungi. Fungi are heterotrophic, which means they have to go outside of themselves to make food. Like I mentioned earlier with the plantae, they also have cell walls, which is these rigid structures around the cells that contain something called chitin. Now, you don't really need to know what that is, but this chitin is a special chemical that only fungi have and plants don't have it. So it's also helps scientists identify what is a fungi. They go through cellular mitosis with no cytokinesis. So what that means is, in biology, there is a process called cellular division. And basically, when a cell gets old, they have to find a way to make new cells. So when a cell gets old, they start a process called mitosis, where this old cell will divide into two cells, which are now new cells. So the last step of this process is called cytokinesis, and it's when these two cells are completely pulled apart, they're barely touching, and it's almost like a lot of teachers will teach it like it's like a karate chop. It like forcefully breaks it apart into finally two cells. And if you don't have cytokinesis, this will still happen, but it will happen at a way slower rate. So this is very important because it could mean the cellular division is not happening as frequently as it does in the other kingdoms. So again, this is a rather specific thing, but it is a reason why scientists classify fungi into this kingdom, or like species into this kingdom. They're also non-vascular organisms, meaning they don't have veins throughout all of them that deliver water. They reproduce using spores, which you see this with flowers. Mushrooms will produce little things that will kind of float on the wind to then plant themselves in the soil. Examples are yeast, molds, and the most famous species in this kingdom is mushrooms. So now we're going on to, in my opinion, the most important one, which is protista. Protista is the most common in science fair experiments. What you're going to run into if you decide to go the animal sciences or biology way, specifically animal sciences, is there's a lot of regulations in animal sciences. And because of we want to protect the animals and make sure we're not harming these animals and experimenting them, you usually are not allowed to use anything with a vertebra. And if you do, you usually have to go to special labs. And some people are able to do that, but most people have real challenges finding ways to work with labs, to work with these species. So you can work with plants if you want to do something like that, but if you want to work with something that really does feel alive, not that plants aren't alive, but you know what I mean, protista is the way to go. So despite they do look rather simple looking, but they actually are all eukaryotes, which means they have a nucleus, they are complex organelles. Most of them are multicellular. They reproduce asexually, which is kind of like the spores thing with fungi. And they're usually found in water environments. So again, I really want to hark on this point. It's really good to do research in the differences of different protista. I, for one, found a protista called Daphnia, which is a very keystone for a lot of freshwater environments. And I was able to test it in water environments. And the really unique characteristic that I found with that I'd love to give as an idea is its heart rate is visible through a microscope. So you can test it, you can try all these different variables in testing it, and then see what effect those will have on its cardiac health, because you can view it through a microscope. So that's a really special characteristic. You also don't usually need permission. You can get these from biological supplies. Anyway, it's a forgotten kingdom, but I'm just harking on this point that if you are deciding to work in the animal sciences field, this is what you will be working with most probably, at least for a science fair. Now on to the microscopic ones. Archaebacteria. They are prokaryotes. This kingdom was the original life forms on Earth before evolution happened and things got more complex. Everything was prokaryotes, meaning they didn't have a nucleus. They were very simple, very small, no organelles. They had membranes containing lipids that no other kingdom has. But what makes them really different than from eubacteria, the thing that really makes scientists classify these as archaebacteria, is they live in extreme conditions, such as volcanic vents. You'll find these in volcanic vents. You'll find these in underwater frozen caves. Anything that is extreme conditions, you'll find these in. So just remember, archaebacteria, extreme conditions. Archaebacteria, extreme conditions. So then the last kingdom is eubacteria. They have a lot of the same characteristics as archaebacteria. They are unicellular, which means they're made up of one cell. Excuse my dog, who's getting all wild up. They're prokaryotes, which means they don't have a nucleus and they don't have a lot of organelles. The difference is between archaebacteria is that eubacteria will get you sick. This type of bacteria is the cause for many diseases. It's basically where germs are, especially in the climate we have today. You can find eubacteria anywhere. It's probably on your hands right now. Germs are everywhere. So this is actually the most common out of all of the kingdoms because there's millions and millions of them just everywhere. Not to creep you out or anything. So why do we care about classifying species? Being able to group species by characteristic helps people see trends in behavior. Really, it gives a good comparison for things, especially in terms of evolution. Because like I was saying, species in the same genus are very similar. And not only will you tend to see similar trends in behavior, but if you want to test or experiment on to figure out how certain chemicals react with certain species, it's maybe best to work with other species in that genus. Like a lot of times for us, when they're testing vaccines, they won't start with testing them on humans. They'll start with testing monkeys or apes because those are in our similar genus. They're in the same genus as us. So that's why they're starting with that, because they have so many similar biological similarities. So it's just really important to know the specific genuses and even to know certain kingdoms, just know the basic ways scientists are deciding to group things. And again, naming species. Like I was talking about earlier, scientists need a common language throughout the world so that they know what species everyone is talking about. There's also, especially when you get into bugs, there's very slight differences between certain species. So the way they do it is they call a species scientific name is the genus and then the species. Again, having these makes it easy for scientists to talk wherever they are in the world. It's the same thing why every scientist uses the metric system. They need a universal system that they can use. And the similarities in species can help scientists see evolution patterns. let's say every species in this genus used to have a tail, and now they've evolved so they don't. If one species evolved to, let's say, now they have whiskers, would other species in that genus see similar evolution patterns? Or is it more based on habitat? These are questions that scientists have, and it helps them by having groups. So before I start talking about the organization of life, I'll quickly stop and see if anyone has questions, strictly speaking, on the kingdoms and classification in general. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. I will wait 2 or 3 minutes just to see if anyone has questions on this classifications kingdoms section. I have one question here, which is, what's the kingdom that you said was the most forgotten but the most common in science fair projects? That is the protista kingdom. That's where you'll find stuff, amoeba, paramecium, and daphnia. So those are in freshwater sources. So just look up water and protistas, and that should be good for you. Okay. I think we have waited enough time. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Let's continue on to the organization of life. So this is a concept because scientists love to classify things and organize things. So one of these is the organization of life, which will slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the most basic is the cell, which we've already discussed. There's eukaryotes and there's prokaryotes, and they have all the membranes. You can see a human cell. But a new concept for many of you maybe will be tissue, which is just multiple cells together. A lot of times you hear this in skin tissue, a small portion of your body where there's a lot of cells made up is just tissue. When these cells get more complex and there's more tissues added together, it becomes an organ. A traditional one is one most people know is the heart, but the lungs is also an organ, the brain. But when talking about an organ, there's more than just, there's stuff that leads off from the heart. The heart is connected to other things. It's connected to the veins that run throughout your body, and also can be connected to the lungs and the brain and all of this stuff. So all of this makes up something called an organ system. An organ system with the heart is the cardiovascular system. Now there's multiple organ systems throughout your body that all serve different functions and all help each other out, but have different functions. One will be to break down food, your digestive system. One is to help you go to the bathroom. One is to help you breathe. One spreads blood throughout your body. These are the different systems. And all of these organ systems work together to then make up an organism, which is you. And going from organism, that's when you start to build up a biome. And we'll talk about that jump from an organism to a biome. But first, let's talk about something called abiotic versus biotic factors. Now, when looking at any environment, you will discover abiotic and biotic factors. So let's talk about biotic factors first. These are the living components of any ecosystem. These are tree, deer, squirrel. A lot of people think of these as the living animals they see around, but you have to remember that grass, flowers, they're all still living. So they are all still part of the biotic factors. All of these biotic factors have 3 types. Autotrophs, which are animals who make their own food, living things that make their own food, again, usually through photosynthesis. Then there's heterotrophs who have to go outside of themselves to make food. Again, this could still be eating vegetation, still counts as going outside of yourself for food. And then there's decomposers who usually can eat the dead animals' nutrients and feed off that, usually in the soil. But something that's also quite important is abiotic factors. These are the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Well, what's non-living in an ecosystem? This is stuff like sunlight, temperature, water, oxygen, pH. These things still have an effect on the ecosystem. If we're talking about an ecosystem and we're like, well, the oxygen levels are dropping, that's still going to have an effect on the organisms living in the ecosystem, the biotic factors of the ecosystem. So they work together, but knowing the difference will help you know how we make the jump from organism to biome. So we have an organism, right? We've gone from cell to tissue to organ system. Now we're at organism. Now we have organism versus biome. So organism is only one thing. So only one giraffe, one organism. The next step up from that is population, which is multiple of the same animal. If you have 7 giraffes, that is the population. A lot of times you hear this phrase in the lion population in Africa is dropping, which just means the number of lions in Africa is dropping. The next step up from that is a community. And this is any animals that are interlaced together and work together or work against each other. Usually they are almost always in the same habitat. So habitat is an animal's home. It's where they live. And this community could be a giraffe's prey. What does a giraffe eats? Or what eats a giraffe? But again, since this is all biotic factors, grass could also be a part of the community. If giraffe is eating grass, then it's a part of the giraffe's community. So this could be maybe 8 or 9 species that all work around each other to form a community. So that already kind of sounds like an ecosystem. What's the difference between a community and an ecosystem? And that's where we introduce abiotic factors. An ecosystem is everything I just said with species that work together in multiple species, but then adding abiotic factors such as water, light, temperature, oxygen, and that forms an ecosystem. Like I previously mentioned on the last slide, these abiotic factors still affect the ecosystem and the species living in it. If there was a drought, then animals would die because they didn't have water. A biome takes everything that we just said about an ecosystem and it gives it a specific habitat and a specific place that they live. And there's usually characteristics for these biomes that we will go over. And there are usually, most people say there's about 10 biomes. So let's start talking about those. To make sense of complexity, humans often need to categorize or group things. We have food groups, sexes, eye colors, ages, movie genres, to name a few. We categorize all types of things, whether they are ideas or objects, and whether they are small or large. One of the largest things we try to categorize may be the type of environments found on Earth. The natural world is more varied than we can imagine, and one way to make this variation easier is to put environment types into groups. We can divide our surroundings many ways: by how much water there is, by how warm it is, or by the types of plants or animals we found there. There also can be many types of ecosystems in a biome. Usually we group them in different natural areas on Earth into categories based on plant and animal life and how they're able to survive in that part of the world. Making groups based on living organisms can be very complicated. A biome is a type of environment that is defined by the types of organisms that live there. We can also think of these as life zones. Again, like I said earlier, bio means life, dividing land up in this way. So let's talk about areas that are similar, even if they're on different continents. Biome categories can be broad or narrow. When we say forest, you might picture a cool area with pine trees, or instead you might think of a wet, dark, noisy rainforest. According to some people, all forest types belong in one group, the forest biome. But others think that temperate forests, which are seasonally cool, are very different from tropical rainforests. If we take a closer look at these temperate and rainforests, we see that they differ quite a bit in the amount of rain they get and in their temperatures, which are all abiotic factors: temperatures, amount of rain, abiotic factors. Tropical rainforests are warm and don't experience a winter season, but temperate forests have a defined winter with snow when temperatures below zero. With those cold temperatures, the plants and animals in temperate rainforests have to have adaptations to deal with cold weather. Do those groups seem different enough to you to be in a separate biome? Is a question for a lot of scientists. So talking about some of the biomes here, we have a tropical rainforest. You probably picture that as a jungle where it's warm all year. There are too many animals to count, and the huge numbers of trees keep their leaves year-round. Many of these trees have multiple layers of leaves, and many of these forests get so much rain that there isn't a dry season, which is a big difference from that and, let's say, a temperate forest. Temperate forests have 4 relatively distinct seasons, and many of the trees shed their leaves in the fall and become inactive throughout the cold weather or cold winter. In these forests, this is where you're going to find deer, woodpeckers, bear, stuff like that. You also have a desert. I feel like this one's pretty easy for most people to separate, but deserts, they're the hottest biome. But they also can get really cold temperatures in the winter. Basically, really what defines this is the extreme swings in temperature, and that the fact that many animals have to burrow underground to find more stable temperatures. They also, species living in deserts have to be able to go long periods without water. Then we have tundras, which they're flat and cold with low plants like grass and moss that only grow during the short summer. A thick layer of ice lies just below the shallow soil. This is something called permafrost, and that ice lays all year round, and trees cannot penetrate it to anchor their roots. So there usually is very few trees, or there are specific trees that don't need that. You also will find a lot of small mammals during the winter in protected tunnels under the snow. We also have the boreal forest. This one you might not have totally heard. It's also been called the taiga. It's the largest land biome in the world. It is made up of mainly conical-shaped evergreen trees. These trees are also called conifers because their seeds are clumped into cones. That's why they're called like conifers. The taiga has long, cold winters when most mammals hibernate, but they don't have that permafrost, which separates them from a tundra. These look a little bit more like grasslands. Speaking of grasslands, they're usually temperate grasslands are called plains or prairies, and these are usually made up almost entirely of short to tall grasses. And they get just enough rain to have these grasses, but they usually stay dry enough where there's a lot of fires. We also have the savanna, and these are tree-studded grasslands where they receive enough seasonal rainfall so the trees can grow in open groups. The animals living there have long legs for escaping predators and are usually seen in herds. You see a lot of these in Africa, like the African savannas. So that's not talking about all of the ones of the 10 biomes, but that's just kind of a quick summary of some of the biomes we have. So a very, very important concept is food chains and food pyramids. So the concept is a concept of energy, and that energy flows through all things. So on the left, you see food chains. A lot of times in biology, you'll be asked a question, and it's like, make a food chain out of this food chain. And basically what that means is follow the flow, follow the arrows. So let's say you go nuts, and then you follow the arrows, you see a red-breasted nuthatch. Follow the arrows, you go western whiptail, and then you can follow the arrows to any of the other ones. Let's say you go coyote. So you would write that all out with arrows pointing, and that would be a way to answer those questions about food chains, because that's one chain. So there are levels of animals in food chains. There is producers. So producers are anything that are autotrophic, meaning they make their own food. Primary consumers are herbivores, meaning they only eat plants. Nuts are also kind of included in that. So primary consumers will only eat like nuts, fruits, insects, seeds, plants, flowers, anything that's autotrophic really. And that's why they're called primary consumers. And then secondary consumers will eat them. They'll eat these squirrels, deer, stuff like that. And then moving up from there, you have tertiary consumers. So there's a concept of energy, which is autotrophic plants who make their own food. They get close to 100% of the energy from that food. 100% of the energy from photosynthesis. But when primary consumers eat these producers, they don't get 100% of the energy. A little bit of the energy is lost, let's say 30%, to decomposers who then eat these leftover nutrients, usually in the soil or like actual dead animals. So every time there's like a transaction, anytime anything eats something else, there's a little bit of loss of energy. So if the producers get 100% of that energy, primary consumers may get 70%. Let's say secondary consumers get 50%. So secondary consumers, let's say they eat a Douglas squirrel. They're only able to get, the Douglas squirrel only has, let's say, 70% energy. Well, if you lose a little bit of that energy, then the black-tipped jackrabbit is only having 50% of that energy. Let's say the bobcat eats that. Well, it's only getting, let's say, 20% of that energy. So this is a very important concept because, as you can see, when you go higher up the food chain, these things are, mountain lions, let's say, are eating more things because they need a higher variety of things to eat because of this concept of energy. They also need to eat more. A mule deer will have a set amount of grass before it's full, but a mountain lion will have to eat way, way, way more animals before it feels full. So that's why these predators are constantly prowling around, constantly looking for this food. So another interesting thing is you have to learn how everything interacts. Let's focus specifically on the red-breasted nuthatch to the western whiptail to the coyote. Let's say there's a decrease in the red-breasted nuthatch population. It could be from outside sources, like from abiotic factors caused this decrease, but no matter what, there was a decrease in the population. What's going to happen? There's going to be a decrease in western whiptails because while they eat other food than just these nuthatches, since one of their food sources, there's a decrease in that population, some of them will starve and there'll be a decrease in that population. And if there's a decrease in the western whiptail population, then you're going to see a decrease in the coyote. The coyote won't have as much an effect, but anytime you look at a food chain, anything above that food chain, if there's a decrease in the species we're talking about, then anything above that species will also see a decrease in their population. What if there's an increase? So let's say increases a lot of times are also caused by decreases in population. That sounds complicated, but let's say there's a decrease in the western whiptail's population. Well, that means that there's going to be less people eating the nuthatch, which means the nuthatch doesn't have as many people regulating its population. So it's just going to keep producing. So there's now a lot of red-breasted nuthatches. Well, that's going to cause a decrease in nuts because they're going to eat up all the available nuts. But what if other producers eat nuts? Well, then they might see a decrease in their population. So it's just a very important thing to know that everything is connected. food pyramids on the right that you're seeing are the same thing as food chains, but I don't like them as much because food chains, you can flow exactly what producer is eaten by which predator and so on and so forth. Whereas food chains, it's like categories, which usually the categories are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, or they say here first order consumers, intermediate predators, top predators. It's the same thing. Competition. So competition and cooperation are how these species interact with each other. There's something called intraspecific competition. Competition is based on the fact that we have scarcity. There is not enough resources to go around. And everything is related to each other. It's all mixing together. It's all dependent on each other. So, like I said earlier, if there was a drought, there's only one water source, then these species are going to fight over that water source. And they might even kill each other over that water source. They could kill each other over food or territory. This also creates a concept called hierarchies. A lot of times when we do see cooperation within species, it's because they're cooperating in packs. And the reason certain species work in packs is because it's easier to hunt things. But to do this, there needs to be a hierarchy, because there needs to be someone who bosses people around. And let's say a pack of lions catches one zebra. Well, there might not be enough zebra to go around, so there needs to be a hierarchy of who can eat. And these hierarchies can be determined a lot of times through fighting and competition. So that's kind of a way that competition and cooperation work in hand. Pack hierarchies are sometimes even seen in humans, but a lot of times people see them in wolves is the one most people know. But anyway, competition is just a really important thing to know, that not all species get along with each other. People in the same population will fight over limited resources, territory, everything based on scarcity. So the last topic of today is, as we were talking about competition and cooperation, another thing to talk about is symbiotic relationships. So symbiotic relationships are the way that different animals interact with each other, different species. And scientists, because they love to classify everything, found a way to classify this into three groups: mutualism, commensalism, and parasiticism. Mutualism, an example of mutualism is, let's say you have a brother, and you tell that brother, hey, if you do my homework, I will go buy you ice cream. The brother benefits because he gets ice cream, and you benefit because someone does your homework. Your homework is now done. That's where both species benefit. An example of mutualism in the animal world is the relationship between the Egyptian plover and the crocodile. In the tropical regions of Africa, the crocodile lies with its mouth open. The plover flies into its mouth and feeds on bits of decaying meat stuck in the crocodile's teeth. The crocodile does not eat the plover. Instead, he appreciates the dental work. So the plover gets a meal and the crocodile gets his teeth cleaned. So both species benefit. The next thing is commensalism. This is when one species benefits and one just has no effect. There's no negative effect, there's no positive, there's just no effect. So an example would be, in the animal world, would be the remora fish are very bony and have a dorsal fin that acts like a suction cup. Remoral fish use this fin to attach themselves to whales. So the remora fish gets a meal off the whale, but the whale gets nothing. It isn't harmed by these remora fish attached to it. It's not harmed, but it's not helped either. But the remora fish gets a free meal. So that's commensalism. Then we have parasiticism. An example of this is lice and human hair. Lice will suck our blood on our scalp. They get nutrients from our blood, and it harms us because we're being bitten. Another example is mosquitoes. If you get a mosquito bite, they've gotten nutrients from your blood, but it didn't help you. It actually harmed you, caused an injury to you. A deer tick is a parasite. It attaches to a warm-blooded animal and it feeds on its blood. They get blood at every stage of their lifestyle. So they're benefiting from the blood, but these deers are getting harmed. So that is a summary of ecology and biology, some overview of certain topics, and really how things work together, whether it's against each other or not, and how things are classified. So I will open the floor up to questions. Tomorrow I will be giving another lecture, which will focus on the cycles, the nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, water cycle, but it will also spend a lot of time talking about different environmental problems, because what we're supposed to be taking from this information is then going into science fair, science project stuff. So I will then talk about big environmental problems and project ideas for all of them and like how that's going to work. So while I wait for some questions to come in and answer some questions, I just thought I'd say that. Okay. Is a stick a biotic factor or even a supply like a pencil? A stick would be it depends. If the stick is still attached to a tree, then it is a biotic factor because it's still alive. Once you break a stick off, I think I would still call it a biotic factor because it used to live, but it's now dead. So, like, you wouldn't call a dead deer not a biotic factor because it used to live. Okay, and what is a boreal forest, and what is the difference between a boreal forest and a tropical forest? So a tropical forest, the usual big difference is rain levels and how much there is in rain levels, and also how many leaves there are and the different levels of leaves. And since most of the things at the bottom of a rainforest get very limited light, you might get a lot of species that can climb trees so that they can get light. And a boreal forest is also known as the taiga. This is where you're going to find a lot of evergreen trees. It's cold, but not as cold as a tundra. It's like an in-between of a temperate forest and a tundra. There's evergreens and it's cold, but there's no snow on the ground. That's, if that makes sense. Why do tropical rainforests get so much rain? Just weather patterns and where they lie in certain areas. If they lie really close to the coast, it could also be pick up from that. For science fair projects, what are my recommendations? Some ones I can think off the top of my head are working with Daphnia, or working with other protistas and looking through characteristics, trying pH levels. Some people try different sodas, maybe caffeine, no caffeine, and see the effects that'll have. I will have a lot more science fair like recommendations tomorrow, because I will talk a lot of environmental problems, and then there's things you can do with those projects that are different and new. And because you could talk about with the environment, you can do there's a lot you can do. You can do climate change based projects. You can do things talking about acid rain. You can do things talking about oil rigs and how to prevent oil spills and ways we can clean those up. There's ones you can do for coral protectants. There's a lot you can do. So that's some ones I can give you right now. Is there any other questions? I will wait. Is the category of biomes already determined, or different researchers have different categorizations? Biomes generally, you're generally going to see the same 10 biomes, but a point of contention between different researchers is whether there should just be a forest biome or whether it should be a tropical rainforest biome, temperate forest biome, taiga, which is the boreal forest. Some people argue that there should be three separate because there's different rain levels and different species of plants and trees that grow there. But some are like, they're all a forest, just make a forest biome. So in some ways there are different categorizations, but stuff like a desert, pretty much any scientist you talk to is going to be like, yeah, that's its own biome. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, I think that is all for the questions. Thank you for everyone who stayed for the hour, and please tune in tomorrow for a lecture on the different cycles and the different environmental problems. Thank you.